proven to, enhance worker effectiveness and team collaboration, across all different types of industries and sizes of companies, really letting workers use the channel of their choice and the device of their choice to communicate and collaborate from any location. And UC's been around for quite a while right now, but it's gone through a lot of changes in the past few years, especially with the move to the cloud and also the growth of service provider platforms, making it easier for service providers, carriers, and operators to provide a wide range of offers for their customers. So there have been a lot of opportunities for service providers, but there have also been more challenges. How to differentiate in a crowded market, how to stay profitable in the cloud era, how to meet customers' needs in this constantly changing market. The list goes on and on. One of the more recent challenges is keeping up in an agile development world, where features are introduced practically on a daily basis, and this adds a lot of complexity for service providers who they have to keep up with Zoom and Microsoft and Cisco and others that have embraced this agile development model. So today we have an expert panel to discuss some of the trends, challenges, and ways to overcome this constantly changing environment. So let's start by a very quick introduction of our panelists. So Rich, why don't you get started?
All right, good afternoon. My name is Rich Shaw. I'm the managing director of the Shaw Strategies consulting firm, and I just wrapped up a 34-year career at AT&T.
Great, thank you. Scott?
Hi, I'm Scott Hoffbauer. I'm with True North Advisory. We work with a number of technology companies helping with product strategy and go-to-market. And formerly, I'm one of the founders of BroadSoft.
Yeah, that little company some people might have heard of. Peter?
Hi, I'm Peter Eisengrine. I am Executive Vice President at Evolve IP and one of the founding partners here. And I'm responsible for all things voice within our company.
Great. And Chakra?
Yeah, I'm Chakra Devala. I'm the CEO for TechVision. And TechVision, as you know, is an industry leader in continuous testing, interoperability, and primarily certification programs for large platform vendors like Microsoft, Cisco, Zoom, and of course we work with several service providers as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's start with some questions for the panelists. And for the audience, please feel free to add questions to the questions or chat tab in the panel, because we'd love to hear from you and get your questions answered also. So let's start with the softball. What are some of the trends in the UC and contact center market that impact service providers and carriers? Rich, why don't we start with you?
All right, Blair, thanks. Well, certainly there's a lot going on in unified communications and contact center. These markets are hyper competitive as the Zooms, et cetera, are trying to differentiate themselves. And we have some really, really good companies seeking to innovate, and a lot of new features are being rolled out into the marketplace. A lot of new capabilities like AI are being used to improve the overall experience, from translation capabilities to things like providing real-time coaching, measuring customers' emotional reaction to an agent. While this is going on, companies are also needing to change how they architect their networks, especially now that they have remote and distributed workers. For enterprises seeking to develop a consistent experience for the remote worker. Many are using technologies like SD-WAN, which traditionally is difficult when paired with real-time things like voice and video traffic. So how do these trends impact carriers and solution providers? It's complexity. Our SMB customers, our enterprise customers are going to require and demand more support for UC and contact center. They're going to need more upfront support, setting up all these new unique features and technologies, and it's really going to be difficult for them to keep up with all the changes. Blair, especially as you mentioned, as new software updates are being downloaded and new features are being presented, to their end users. So it's going to force carriers to bring their security, their voice, their networking teams really all together to drive best practices in implementing wide deployments of networks and SD-WANs, and then helping to troubleshoot all of those scenarios, and then certainly moving this into a non-office type of deployment just adds another level of complexity to it. So those are some of the key things that I see.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned AI, because that is just so huge and is going to have such an impact, especially in the contact center, as you mentioned. Scott, what about you? You've been around the block in this area a couple times. What are you seeing as some of the big trends?
Yeah, I think like both of you guys said, with all of the leading solutions out on the market now, they're delivering new capabilities sometimes on a daily basis. And, that means that for service providers specifically, that there's a lot of change and a lot of situations where you really kind of have to go back and validate and verify that everything's still working. In the old days, you may update once every year or 2 years. Now you're probably updating every week. And there's certainly a lot more complexity. All of the leading solutions now have calling, meetings, messaging. They're also adding lots of features and options and different capabilities that cater to different industries and different verticals. And Rich, you mentioned AI. It seems like nowadays UC and CC is kind of converging, where you're using AI to try to get every piece of information out of a conversation or an interaction. And even phone systems now are kind of being used for informal call centers and sales type functions. And then, I think all of the big platforms now are platforms. They have APIs, making it really easy to integrate other applications with voice or messaging capabilities. And that's great, but that also introduces a certain level of complexity and customization that, for service providers, that becomes a bit of a challenge because they have to make sure it all works and everything is set up properly. And then I think, Rich, like you mentioned, service providers often want a bundle, and they want to take their access, their networking, their security, and put it together with the unified communications and contact center solutions. And again, all great, but I think you got to make sure it all works together, and everything is working together in a nice cohesive way. And then you also have to make sure it works everywhere. We sort of take it for granted that you can access and use services from anywhere, but especially with telephony type services, you may have things in other countries or other locations, and you've got to make sure that works and the quality is there. So all in all, I think the good news with the market is we're getting some incredible things. Probably for service providers, it's not like the old days where everything was simple and easy. Now you've got to kind of continuously make sure everything is working as expected.
Was it ever simple and easy?
Well.
So I'm really glad you mentioned, the integration of UC and contact center, because that's something I've been talking about for many, many years, and we're finally seeing it happen. And as you mentioned, companies are using some of these tools for informal contact centers that never really happened before. And we're seeing, all different types of people in the organization being responsible for, interacting with customers and providing that customer experience. So that's another trend that's really big, and I see that continuing on. Any trends that we missed that anybody wants to add?
No, I think Rich and Scott covered most of it. Just the one thing that I wanted to add is the trend that I've been seeing is the UC applications or CC. These applications are becoming more like the browsers of the internet, right? I mean, in a productivity environment, they're connected to everything. So it's not just messaging, calling, and meetings, but it is also connected to SharePoint and CRMs, and it's just like one central area where employees or productivity comes together.
Yeah, so certainly complexity is increasing. So let's go to our second question or topic. What are the main challenges service providers and carriers face in this agile, constantly changing environment? So, certainly Scott mentioned some of the challenges. So Peter, what do you see as some of the big challenges providers are facing right now?
Echoing off of what Scott said is that if you go back just a few years ago, the control was all within the service provider's space, because you pretty much ran everything and all of it was within your control. And that's probably certainly true for the larger providers today, because they're still developing all their own tools and their own products. But for the mid providers like Evolve IP, where we play, we're kind of a hybrid. We have our own contact center, but we're using Broadworks as our UC. And from there, you're then integrating to a whole bunch of other things. So in the last several years, you've got this shift towards a more interconnected, the interconnected cloud, where you're offering the services, but you're kind of the glue of all of these services, and making sure that you're offering a really quality product to the end user, and making sure that you're staying on top of the innovation and giving them the products and features that they need. So that was sort of the first part of this. Now, the second half of this challenge is the fact that, as you mentioned, so many of them are beginning to move into an agile development format, where they're delivering even monthly is often enough, because if you're interconnecting 6 or 10 things together, and this is everything from your PSTN carriers and your own equipment, your own transport equipment, your session border controllers, all of these things are in this constant state of change. So if you've got 10 things and they all change once a month, well, you're changing something every third day. And trying to make sure that all of this plays nicely is great. So, on the positive side of Agile, in theory, you're touching less, just more frequently. So less things are apt to break. But that's still kind of theory, right? Because there's still things that do break, and we're all well aware of when that happens. But the complexity, the other thing too, is that as things shifted into the cloud, it used to be this level of complexity where you had a UC provider and a contact center provider and maybe a CRM, and maybe all of those were cloud-based, but that complexity was at the customers. It was their complexity to manage. Now all of that's moved into the cloud services provider, and the customers expect the seamless integration between all of these things. And again, like an Evolve IP or another service provider in our space, we're now expected to be able to manage all of these integrations, and they're constantly changing on us, right? So the keeping up on the changes, from everything from testing it to rolling it out. If we're responsible for rolling out, maybe the other partners are, documenting this, teaching support. All of these things just continue to get faster paced, and it's a great problem to have, but it's still a problem.
Okay, great. Chakra, how about you?
No, I think Peter, brings up some great points, right? See, because if you look at it, most of the best practices or operational best procedures were all centered around the 5 nines. We all lived. Anybody who's been long enough to work with the telecom space, they know the 5-9 mantra, right? The procedures, everything. Whenever anything changes in the network, you kind of validate it. You make sure that way you can meet the SLAs. There's, obviously we all lived through that, right? I mean, there's commitments and penalties for SLAs and all those things. But when things are changing, I'll give you a simple example. So the month of June, which is not done yet, of 2022, Microsoft Teams had 13 updates, and Zoom had, I think, five or six, right? And granted, they're all not related to calling or meetings and so on, but nevertheless, still coming from that 5-9 mentality and mindset, when things are changing, it's very difficult. And nowadays, like Peter, you were alluding to, the PSTN service is provided by operators like service providers, and the platform providers provide the UC services which they are offering. And now it's like truly two clouds independently releasing and managing. But at the end of the day, the user has to have the best experience, right? The 5 nines. So yeah, absolutely. It creates a challenge. It creates an opportunity for the market, because we're moving fast and releasing great features. And I mean, obviously, this COVID times or the pandemic time, we all know how fast businesses could move their employees home and bring them up. And I know collaboration, our UC technology helped that, right? But that also creates the challenge. So that's how I would like to just sum it up there.
Okay, great, thank you. So Liz, I think it's time to hear from the audience, and we've got a poll question. So what's your number one challenge? Select one of the following. Need for speed, increasing the frequency of feature releases, causing some challenges. Hybrid work with too many device models and the transition between desktop and tablet and other devices. The growth of the UC suite with so many things being added to what we consider unified communications, just growing and growing. Or merging unified communications as a service and contact center as a service. We talked about the two of them coming together, which is a great opportunity, but also a challenge. So if everyone can pick one of those, and we'll present the findings soon. And also, if any of you have important challenges that aren't listed here that you want to type into the chat, we'd love to hear that also. So feel free to also add into the chat what you see as some of the challenges. So any expectations for what we might see as the number one challenge?
I think giving a great customer experience is the biggest challenge for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as demands for customer experiences keep growing. So whether it's the user experience in a UC environment, or customer experience in a CCaaS environment, expectations for I just want this to work seamlessly and easily, that just keeps growing and growing.
Yeah.
So, and hopefully we will have the results here shortly. I guess people up. Okay, so the number one challenge, it's a three-way tie. So the need for speed, hybrid work, and merging UCaaS and CCaaS. So the growth of the UC suite doesn't seem to be as challenging, so that's good. But certainly need for speed and hybrid work, of course. Just looking at our panel, I think half of us are working in the office and half are working from home, and making all that work together is certainly a challenge. And merging UCaaS and CCaaS, and as I said, I think that's going to continue to be an issue going forward, because more and more companies are doing that and expecting that. So let's move on to our third question. So we talked about the challenges, and so how do these challenges impact the end user experience? As Chakra mentioned, it's all about the user experience. So how do we see these challenges impacting that? Scott, why don't we start with you?
Okay, yeah. I think when we talk about user experience, that's a pretty broad term. I think these days you have the end user experience, you have the administrator experience, you have the developer experience. So you have different stakeholders, different users of the service that all expect the service to work, as advertised. And I think even for relatively simple things like Microsoft and Operator Connect, you're taking telephony and you're integrating it with a service. The user experience should be the same regardless of what telephony you're using. But oftentimes these things don't work exactly the same between carriers. Sometimes things work differently in different countries. And you have to just make sure that end user experience is really doing what it's supposed to be doing. And, I know we've spent a lot of time with Operator Connect and trying to make sure that, it meets kind of what Microsoft has set forth there. But that can be quite a challenge, and sometimes it's things way outside the control of Microsoft or the service provider. Sometimes it's just, do you have the right access? Do you have the right connectivity? Do you have the right quality of service? But as an end user, you expect it all to work perfectly. And then I think as you get into contact centers, it becomes even more challenging. Now you have all sorts of different digital channels being introduced. Your customers may talk to you over Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, and you don't necessarily have control over any of that. And something may change that impacts how that particular messaging is connected to your contact center. And it could change overnight, and you wake up in the morning and nothing works like you expect it to work anymore. So I think these changes really sort of impact service providers in that you just have to kind of continuously make sure everything works. You can't test something one time and then expect that it to continue to work. You sort of have to have a mindset of continuous testing, and not only just continuous testing of the functionality, but also of all the different locations and so forth. I remember at BroadSoft, we used to have outages because of a firewall setting. So during the maintenance window one night, somebody would change the firewall setting, and you wake up in the morning and nothing would work. And stupid mistake, but it was impacting the user experience in a pretty big way. So I think, as you put all these things together, you really got to work hard to make sure it works as expected.
Yeah, and you mentioned contact centers, so we have to think about the agent experience as well. So, when new features and capabilities are added on a continual basis, how does that impact the agent? Because they have to learn these new things all the time. So that takes, training and coaching, and that's not easy either. So that brings on, a whole other slew of changes or challenges. Chakra, how about you? What do you see as this impacting the experience?
I completely agree with everything Scott said. I mean, the one thing that I see as this challenge being amplified from a user experience perspective is being that hybrid environment, right? Where people are working remotely. Before, if my call doesn't work or something doesn't work on my screen, I can just get up, walk across, and ask my colleague or something. Now, if it doesn't work, it's tough if I'm working from home, right? And you want to make that, so make sure that that the changes are not constantly impacting, where they're constantly having to relearn or something doesn't work and it impacts their productivity. And we all have seen several times, right? We join a conference call or something, and we keep talking away, and default it used to be unmuted, but now we go into default mute. Oh, then we realize it. It's a simple nuisance, but it is just that little user experience. So that's one small example. But yes, change, especially when it is so consistent. All of these UC, CC clients are constantly pushing this software so often. It's hard. You have to be making sure that that's continuously working.
Okay, so we talked about the challenges. Now, what are the solutions? So what are some ways of mitigating these challenges? Rich, why don't we start with you?
I think there's a couple of different approaches that we can use to try to mitigate some of these challenges. I know some of the things we're beginning to see are bringing in more specialty teams that can support these kinds of implementations. Everything from selling, to the implementation, to really the training and operations of this, to have the right experts on hand to help the customers. I think all of us that are on this call and probably attending the call are technologists. We love technology. We love the shiny new thing. If I'm a call center agent, I'm trying to figure out how to help my customer, and I don't want to be overwhelmed by the technology and constant change, because I've got a regular day job of keeping up with my customer, and I need these tools to help me not get in the way. And so I think that that level of specialization in really kind of getting in to understand how the customers are using these tools can help carriers and service providers really speak the language of the customer, have a better context of how it's being used, not looking at it just from a technology sake. And if you can couch it in that context, it's got, I think, a greater chance of being adopted and used and really embraced by the end users.
Okay, thanks. Peter, how about you?
I see three ways that we need to tackle this. The first, it should be standard practice in most organizations around change control. And using the example that Scott gave with the firewall, those kinds of change control things still will bite you sometimes, right? Somebody makes a change, they think it's the right thing to do, and it probably is. But going through a standard change control with peer review and approvals and so forth, that helps to minimize the amount of damage that you're causing in that way. So again, I think that one probably check the box in most organizations. The next thing that we can do as an industry is champion standards. And I'll give you an example. If you look at how the nomadic 911 is being handled as a result of raybounds, the government stepped in, and they've done this a number of times in the last couple of years. They came in and said, okay, we're going to do the following things, but they didn't tell anybody how. They just said, go make it happen. And when you look at the two big guys, you look at WebEx and Microsoft, how they're doing nomadic 911 is completely different, which means that now the operators, the service providers, need to do multiple things. And maybe you do too. Maybe you also sell Zoom. Maybe they're doing something different altogether. So now you've got multiple flavors of the same thing. And I think as an industry, if we begin to come together and really promote standardization. Now, are we ever going to change the minds of Microsoft? Probably not. But I think if we do try to make suggestions and give direction, and here's how I think we should do it. And if there's boards, advisory boards that help drive some of these things, and there are, that certainly helps. The other thing that standards help are the build once and deploy many thing. And as a service provider myself, that's my mantra always. I'm trying to let's develop something one way and one way only, and we're going to deploy that way everywhere, as opposed to having different methods of doing things, because now you have to regression test in a whole bunch of different ways. And then standards just tend to break things less because, again, you're doing it one way. Then the third thing really is going to be all around automation. And this is everything from deployment automation and how do you deploy new services. And again, if you go back to Cisco/Broadworks, they've moved into a release independent cycle. So now you're tending to stand up new servers and replace the old, as opposed to doing in-place upgrades. And as we begin to do more of that, and wherever possible you're doing like a blue-green deployment or something like that, we'll certainly make those changes roll out more seamlessly. Now, if we're doing the interconnected cloud thing, we're not necessarily going to have control over all of those things. So you're going to take it however they're deploying it. But where you do have control, if you can automate your deployments, and it's something we're really beginning to do here. Any of our software properties, we're doing that. But for the properties that were, where we're a customer of Cisco or something, we have to deploy based on the standards that are given to us. But last but not least is the regression testing and automating all of that to help keep that cycle moving faster and faster, which I think is why we're all on the phone, right? With TechVision, is the ability to run regression testing that would ordinarily take a human weeks, possibly months, and be able to do that in days instead is a huge benefit, and it's going to be a must-have as we move forward.
So Chakra, that was a great segue for you. So what do you see as some of the ways of mitigating these challenges?
I completely agree with both what the panel has said here. I just want to add a couple of more things. So one area is this continuous testing. See, test in the past, because of the 5.9, the way the agile development has evolved, it moved to a DevOps continuous integration and continuous delivery model. Similarly, the testing and the operational aspects of it has to move into a continuous validation model. And that cannot be achieved without automation. So that part, I completely agree with you, Peter. And with automation, there are two things. First, it is automation. And the second thing is, traditionally in the service provider environments where we have tested with synthetic traffic and so on, where we were talking earlier to the earlier question of the user experience, we really need to test from and validate from a end user's perspective, right? And this is where there are technologies, for example, robotic process automation, where you can emulate all of the user actions on those clients, whether it is a contact center or a UC client, whatever the client may be, and emulate all of the user actions using that robotic process automation, and integrate that into the entire, the developed CI/CD pipeline. So that way you're shifting left and trying to, as and when it's upgraded, like you were saying, Peter, and it automatically kicks off, right? So it is not any more of a static, okay, I tested this release, we can push it out and we don't have to touch it. Instead of that, we're moving into this continuous testing mode. And that's the only way how we see that this challenge can become a manageable problem. Otherwise, this agile development is going to be difficult to manage because you're constantly pushing updates.
Yeah, do you see RPA as requiring, really, really detailed and very rigorous processes, or do you think that as itself will also be able to adapt to, user A does it one way, user B does it another way, but they ultimately do the same things, just maybe in different orders? Do you think we'll get to a point where that just kind of learns through all of those and deals with it?
No, that's a great question, right? Because the sequence of actions that users perform have to evolve. And whereas RPA, this is where RPA is basically the first stage of that AI and automated intelligent-based testing, right? Intelligent testing. So yes, we will have to get there where, and actually there is already some technologies. Like one area is the OCR, where you can use that based on that you can see where the user actions can be recorded and then create test cases around it. So that way, then RPA can emulate those actions, right? But yes, definitely it has to get to that point. But RPA is being used quite a bit in the traditional business processes side of it, but it can actually, we are already using that in the collaboration and the communication testing space. So that way we can automate some of that, yeah.
Okay, so we heard standards, automation, continuous testing, RPA. Scott, are we missing anything? Do you see some other ways of mitigating these challenges?
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, I think if you simplify it, it's almost like you need something to kind of test your solution, what you're getting from your different vendors and some of your core capabilities. Test that almost every night so that, as a service provider, as you wake up in the morning, you kind of get a green light that everything's okay. And I think that's quite a change for a lot of service providers who, traditionally have kind of done it all. I think often the challenge is kind of a trust with their vendors, and that the vendors are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. And some vendors do a really good job of that, some not so much. But I think as a service provider, you really have to understand the offer and then understand, what part really needs to be exercised regularly or every night continuously to make sure it's working. So I think, automation and RPA and regression and, all of that, I think sometimes people think that kind of stuff is easy. And oftentimes, even with a SaaS product, that stuff always comes later in the life cycle, right? you push out new stuff and then you figure out how to automate the testing and validation. And I don't think it's really any different for service providers.
Yeah, very true. Okay.
Let's move on to the last question we've got here. So we talked about, quality and how important that is, and the role of 5 nines. And obviously, service providers have pretty rigid change management processes to get that 5 9 quality and that user experience. So how can they enforce these processes on the reseller model? So Chakra, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. Like the biggest thing that's happening here is, especially as the call control or the UC platforms and the network, like, bring your own carrier, and for example, Microsoft Teams and Opera Connect or WebEx or Zoom, all of them have a very similar thing, Ring Central, the PSTN access and so on, right? And the vendors are coming together too. So one thing that these platform providers, they have agreements in place to take the support and how to escalation processes and so on. So change management has to be also standardized across them, right? Otherwise, things are changing so rapidly, it's going to be very difficult. That's one. And the second thing is the reseller, in the reseller models, the service providers have to be provided with tools so that way they can have visibility into when we are reselling, that then we know what's changed, what the quality of the service is, so that way I can hold the quality of service that I'm delivering to my customers, right? So there should be some standards there and some agreements and some tools, in my opinion. And then, of course, these tools could be, I go back to this continuous testing, right? Because the only way to validate that something is working is to test it. And the platform providers or whoever have to give the tools to the service providers or the resellers, so that way they know that, like Scott was saying, every time I come in the morning, I get a report that everything is working, that I know what the status of my service is at this point. So that's what I think some of the things that can be done for service providers.
Okay, great. Peter, how do you see service providers being able to enforce some of those rigid change management processes for 5 9 quality and the end user experience?
Yeah, I think Chakra hit the nail on the head in terms of being tooled to be able to manage and report on all of your service providers and integrations. One of the challenges, however, is the fact that especially some of the larger public cloud providers, the SLAs that they're giving isn't 5 nines, right? They're in the telephony business. Any of us that have been around for long enough, we're used to a 5 nines SLA, and some of them are giving 4 nines or even 3 nines. So, I think part of that becomes, okay, if they're going to promise something less than what we're all used to, then we really have to be diligent about how do we hold them accountable when they miss even that. Because if they aren't held accountable when they do, then the possibility of it happening more frequently goes up. But the only way to do that is to be tooled to be able to report on, okay, how did provider X perform in the month of June? And that's not a simple task. Any sort of network monitoring is not a simple task. It tends to be a secondary concept in a lot of ways, right? Yes, I've got this thing and it's got to be a product and it's got to have the following features, but how do I monitor for that is often, I wouldn't say an afterthought, but it's often a challenge after. Oh wait, we didn't hit our mark. Okay, how do I know that? And how do they know that? So that's going to be really integral to in keeping that level of quality up, and possibly even, at the end of the day, demanding more out of them, right? 3 nines is not good enough.
No, I don't think anyone would say 3 nines is good enough.
Yeah.
Scott, how about you? What do you see as some of the ways to enforce the processes?
Yeah, I mean, I think service providers, strive for 5 nines for good reason. It's always the kind of thing that if you have it, you don't think much about it. It's when you don't have it, and then that's really when you worry about it. And I think it's got also a lot to do with how critical, the service is. And, for UC, as you've added in meetings and messaging, and these things become more and more critical to, the well-being of a business, then, reliability becomes more and more important. My co-founder at BroadSoft was always famous. When we had an outage, he would calculate how many people were impacted, how long were they impacted, approximately what was their average pay, and then he would deliver to our engineering team how much money they lost, the end customer. And sometimes that's a good way to think about it, right? Is like, if you impacted an enterprise of 10,000 users and they couldn't message or do meetings all day, that's a lot of productivity you've impacted. So I think a lot of times vendors view service providers as being too rigid. And I think Peter's right. A lot of these guys are probably not where they should be. And I think as you move into contact centers, it becomes even more important. I can remember at BroadSoft, we had a situation where we had to bring up the agent experience, we had like a 2-second delay. And, as a developer, you're like, yeah, 2 seconds, whatever. But, we had 5,000 agents using that, and, 2 seconds for every call added up, and you got into the hours at the end of the day, of how much productivity you impacted. And contact centers are, they're a lot more stringent. So, you even see some guys like 5 nines that every quarter, they advertise their reliability numbers. So I think, as Peter said, I think service providers really have to kind of work in lockstep with the vendor to make sure that they're getting, that level of reliability that they need. And oftentimes service providers are adding things like telephony to a contact center or even to UC, and how do you make sure that quality is right? How do you make sure that combination, that overall solution is really working as advertised? So I know at BroadSoft we really had to work closely with our service providers to make sure that that all worked together.
Yep. And as you said, on the contact center side, it's just so important because it impacts the agent productivity and also the customer experience. And if it's a bad customer experience, you lose that customer loyalty and sales and everything. So there's a real huge impact. Rich, what do you have to add?
There was a quote that always sticks in my head. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. And, I think it kind of applies here. Excuse me. I've been holding out pretty well on the coughing. I'm going to turn this a little bit. Some of this too ties into the customers and our role to help customers understand where they need to transition to. A lot of times when we move prem-based loads or kind of classic loads into the cloud, there's a tendency to just replicate what you had before. And there are really a lot of best practices and education that we can bring to our customers to help them in that transition. I can speak personally, looking back on some solutions that we agreed to implement on behalf of a customer, and later regretted it because just it became so custom, it became so complex, and it really wasn't an optimal kind of scenario. So I think not only applying these enforcement models to ourselves, but also looking at our customers and really trying to help them understand how what practice really looks like, and separating the practice from the theory.
Great quote. I love that. We'll all have to remember that one.
Yeah.
Does anyone have anything to add before we go to the audience Q&A?
Yeah, one last point on this. So I mentioned earlier about the move towards this interconnected cloud, and even if all of the players are 5 nines reliable, if they're hitting 5 nines and not 100%, when you do the math and you say, okay, 5 nines times 3, you're now at 4 nines reliability. And I just read somewhere, I think it was the state of California is proposing some sort of a law around quality of service that cloud providers have to give. I don't know if it'll make it through or not, but I think if they do, that will become the norm, and you'll see more states do this. Now, interestingly, you also talked about, I think Chakra mentioned something about the end users and their broadband connection and all of this other stuff. Ultimately, we all need to be able to rely on each other to deliver a super high quality product, or else it all just falls down like a house of cards. And then the question is, who's the state of California going to blame?
Yeah.
Good points. Okay, so that's it for the formal questions. Liz, let me turn it over to you and see if we have any audience questions.
Great, yeah, let me pull those up. Give me just a second.
And if you haven't had a chance to ask any questions yet, please enter it in the chat or the questions bar.
All right, our first question, will service providers become more like a marketplace for unified communications and contact center providers?
Great question. I'll go first. I think the answer is clearly yes. We're seeing it already with Microsoft and Operator Connect, right? Where people are going to Microsoft and selecting their provider through them. We become just another widget on their web page. And again, with the exception of the very large providers who already are doing everything from soup to nuts themselves, but the rest of us are already looking to interconnect and deliver the best possible products through a variety of media. So do we become a widget on somebody's application? At some point, probably, yeah.
Anyone want to add to that? Okay.
All right. What do you all think a provider needs to do to stand out amongst the very crowded space? Most of the things nowadays are table stakes, so what's left for differentiation?
I think there's a big opportunity around adoption management for providers to differentiate themselves. I think we focus a lot on the technology, delivering the technology, and focus more on the administrator. I think Scott, you talked about that earlier, but not as much on the end user, and being able to support that transition, support those end users in a way that they can use this technology to be more productive, to be better sellers or service agents, on behalf of their companies. I think that's really the goal. And so doing that well ultimately is either going to improve the response rate and customer satisfaction of the end customers, of our customers, or it's going to help them drive more revenue. Both of those things are going to make us, much more valuable and really stand out from the next guy that just says, hey, I can integrate a couple of technologies together too.
Yeah, Rich, my colleague and I, Kevin Keeler, we did a survey on end user adoption because we feel it's just so important. And there are so many companies that just don't pay enough attention to it, or it's an afterthought. They kind of think about it after something's already deployed, but you have to really think about end user adoption at the very beginning of the process and get end users involved, at the very beginning to really get the buy-in. So I'll share that study sometime with you.
Good.
Thanks. Next question. Should service providers have to rethink their operational procedures for the DevOps lifecycle?
I can take a first step. At least from what I know I'm not a service provider, but I'm going to just make some comment here. I will let obviously Peter or Rich would be better with their experiences. But definitely, I think with like I said earlier, the changes in the technology and how the adoption rate is going up, definitely the processes and procedures have to be revisited. So that way, because it cannot, in the past, sometimes it may take 6 months to upgrade all the core SBCs or something like that. And, so that cannot be achieved anymore, right? Because that will become the bottleneck, and that will be the competitive differentiator, because you're not rolling out features fast enough, even if you're integrating with a service like Microsoft Teams or WebEx or Zoom, whatever it is. So those have to be revisited and customized to the need of the day.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Shankar. I think that that's part of the automation I talked about earlier. You got testing automation, you got deployment automation, and the two kind of have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, I kind of think of it as it's a bit of a hybrid. If you're developing a service, oftentimes you're building on top of something else. Maybe it's open source or third-party software. And I think, when you're doing a DevOps model and that kind of development, oftentimes you just take that and you build on top of it. And I think service providers have to have a similar type mentality. They're getting a platform from a vendor, they're combining other stuff with it. You have to kind of be a little bit adaptable to kind of build around what you're getting and figure out, where you need to put energy and resources to make sure it all works together. So I wouldn't say it's a pure DevOps type model. It's probably a little bit of a hybrid.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the time we have questions for today. I want to make sure we get to a couple of other items. Here is a link to a landing page where we have compiled some helpful resources, where you can find the link to the webinar recordings, some blogs, some things like that. Don't worry about it if you don't get it right now. I'm going to send out a follow-up email in the next 24 hours with a link to this, so everybody will have that. But if you have a second, you can grab it right from here. And then we also, again, wanted to share the contact information for our panelists if you decide you have any other questions. Again, this will be also linked on the landing page that we send out as well. So to our panelists, any final thoughts or anything like that?
No, I just wanted to, I think this is a great topic, and this is a great time first, because I'm so excited that there's so much change and things are happening in this space. So this is a great conversation. Thanks to all the panelists for the opportunity.
Yep, thank you all for participating. Great discussion.
Yes. Yep. So yes, As Blair said, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to everybody that attended. If you need anything in the meantime, please reach out to us at TechVision. We're happy to forward on any communications if need be. And we hope to see you all in a future session. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.